Today I'll be giving an opposition 3, but first my 3 prop substantives and then my 3 op substantives. First, prop substantive. Voting affects everyone, so it requires civic responsibility. Because voters elect governments that control healthcare, taxes, rights, education, etc., they should have a minimum political knowledge before influencing others' lives. Second sub is the test creates more informed voters and better accountability. Voters become harder to manipulate, politicians make fewer unrealistic promises, and citizens do not have to learn from their mistakes. Third sub is the test creates better societal outcomes. The test establishes political knowledge benchmarks that lead to better policy, more meaningful participation, and a loop where people become more interested in politics once they actually understand it. Next, my 3 opposition substantives. My first substantive is the principle of voting as a right. It basically says that adult citizens are already governed by and taxed by the state, so they deserve equal say over the state without first providing competence to it, and also this idea that in order to uphold the social contract within a democracy, everybody should be able to have say in the government. My second substantive is the test disproportionately harms disenfranchised groups. The tests add costs of time, travel, literacy, internet access, childcare, etc. And these costs disproportionately affect poor, rural, disabled, and elderly and other minority voters and people. My third substantive is the test does not reliably create better outcomes. So voting is often about values, lived experiences, ideology, and complex policy trade-offs. A general knowledge test may create more civic facts, but not necessarily better voting, candidates, or policies. Because we never thought it was okay, then a mother would have to decide between going to work, earning her paycheck, and feeding her kids dinner that night, or taking a political knowledge test. And because we never thought that her voice, her opinions, and her vote mattered any less because of her education level, proud to oppose. Before I move on to the clashes, 2 clarifications. First, proposition's education benefit only works if political knowledge stays current. They model that the test must be retaken every election cycle and that it tests general political knowledge. But if voters must retake it, then all the accessibility harms our second speaker explained become recurrent. Marginalized voters must repeatedly study, travel, take time off work, and arrange childcare just to keep a right that they should already have. If they propose no expiration date, however, they lose their education benefit. People can pass once, stop caring, forget information, or become outdated. So either the test is repeated and exclusionary, or it's one-off and ineffective. Second, proposition is trapped on the difficulty of the test. If the test is too hard, it proves our case. It disenfranchises the very groups with less time and less education. But if the test is too easy, then it does not create the meaningful political understanding proposition claims. At best, it still creates an additional barrier to voting without generating strong democratic benefits. 3 key clashes in today's debate. Clash 1 is voting a right. Proposition themselves claims that as voting affects everyone, voters have the moral duty to protect civic responsibility, and the only way to ensure that they have done so is by enforcing a general knowledge test. However, as our first speaker explained, this is the reason why this must remain a right without this specific barrier. Adult citizens are fully subject to the state. They are taxed and punished through coercive power. Because of this, they deserve equal capacity in choosing that state. Although limits to voting exist, such as age and residency, the test is fundamentally different because it means the state keeps power over people not eligible to vote. In the props world, the state can decide whether someone is politically worthy or not based on an arbitrary test. This is especially unfair when the state has already failed people through poor education, poverty, or unequal access to resources. And it creates a second punishment in which now they cannot vote to change the same problems that made them in the situation in the first place. Furthermore, we never thought that because you were more educated, more privileged, made you principally a better voter than anyone else. The point of a representative democracy is that it truly represents all perspectives. So not only are they infringing on rights, but they also create disingenuous democracies. Clash 2 on does the test generate more informed voters. Props' only offense is that they get more informed voters from their side of the House, which somehow spillovers to, quote, better policies. 3 responses here. First, as stated in our third argument, many people vote primarily based on ideology, identity, values, etc. For example, a voter may not care whether a council person can directly legislate on abortion or immigration, but they may still vote for that council person because the candidate symbolizes their broader values. Proposition never proved why this is specifically bad. In many cases, this is exactly what democratic representation actually looks like, of people choosing candidates who reflect their broader worldview and social interests. But second, the most harmful misinformation will be excluded from the test. Prop claims that the test grounds voters in reality, but to avoid accusations of bias, the test will stick to neutral civics. This is like questions like, what does Congress do? What does the president do? Etc. That means that it will avoid many of the factual disputes that actually drive propaganda. For example, in the U.S., a neutral test may ask what Medicaid is, but it's much less likely to test on how immigrants have access to Medicaid, how they don't, etc. So this creates a dilemma for a proposition. Either the test is neutral and therefore too weak to solve propaganda, or it tests politically contested factual claims and therefore becomes vulnerable to accusations of bias and manipulation, where government mistrust and the sway of propaganda gets amplified. By contrast, we have shown you that an informed vote can be based solely in experience, which is not measured by the test. A voter does not need to pass a test to understand how the government affects their life. For example, a poor person understands the implications of low wages, and a victim of police brutality understands what state violence actually looks like. Class 3, on which side has more accountability, especially for disenfranchised voters. The first question here is whether or not marginalized communities get more or less access on our side of the house. So again, imagine you were the mother who has to take a day off work, find childcare for her kid, and get access to study resources just to walk 2 miles or 2 hours out of her rural area that she's living in because there wasn't a testing center there that she had easy access to. It was never about whether or not those people could pass the test. Maybe they couldn't because they had less resources. Maybe they couldn't because they were less educated. Or maybe they actually could. But it was because the barriers made people less likely to take the test in the first place. They never had the luxury or the flexibility to be able to risk work, to risk their paycheck, to not take care of their kids. They never had the opportunity to take the test. But second, this government accountability turn. Accountability does not depend on how informed voters are, but also on how many people politicians are held accountable by and which groups those people are in. In the world of the prop, fewer people are likely to vote because the test creates an additional barrier. That was the accessibility claim. But once disenfranchised groups become less likely to pass the test or less likely to take it in the first place, politicians have fewer incentives to cater to their interests. This means they're held accountable by a narrow group of people who are actually passing the test. This always looked like privileged and elite people, but they're less accountable to society as a whole. They have less reason to prioritize welfare, housing, or healthcare access if the people most affected by those issues are less likely to vote. This has disproportionate harms on disenfranchised voters. The proposition's only pushback here is that more informed voters would create better policy outcomes that positively affect disenfranchised communities too. However, this depends on the overlapping interests of the voting elite with the disenfranchised minorities, which would absolutely never happen. Also, we're giving you this idea of democratic resolving in governance. What this idea is that sunshine is the best cleanser. So if I'm casting a ballot for a politician that ultimately didn't work out in my advantage for XYZ reasons, next time it's time to vote, I'll vote differently because there were implications to my ballot informed by misinformation. I realized maybe I should be changing the way I'm voting. So, some weighing. First, we win on certainty. Prop's case depends on a chain of uncertain benefits. They need the test to create meaningful knowledge, for it to change votes, and for those votes to elect better politicians who make better policy. We have shown that each link is weak. Education, again, in this debate was a wash because we told you that democracy self-cleanses and that the test was not sufficient to weed out misinformation. So you're weighing on the principle and accessibility. But first, this idea that they're going to create better policy with better votes. What is the goal of politics in a democracy? It was always to be representative of everybody. But why would the government want to control who votes? It's because they wanted to control the outcomes of those votes, which was by nature always undemocratic. So at the end of the day, they're violating this idea of democracy. They're violating the ability that everybody has a right, and they're uniquely violating the right on the side of marginalized communities, disenfranchised communities under our accessibility claim. Accessibility is going to be the main impact of this debate because people uniquely impacted by the tests were those who already had less resources, who already had less education, who already had less flexibility. When they're not able to be deciding factors in who gets to make policy, they get left behind even more. This perpetuates a cycle where the disenfranchised have no opportunity to get a say. That's always going to be worse on their side of the house. Proud to oppose.